Thank you very much. This is a great honor and pleasure to address this conference, and thank you so much for this invitation. I think that Professor Lauretis set the right tone for the next few days. Liberalism and open society is under assault, and it's under assault everywhere. It's under assault as economic project, is under assault as political project, and is under assault as social emancipatory project. When you open the newspaper every morning, it seems like the world is increasingly being ruled by autocrats, lunatics, and gangsters. I'm going to talk in the next 20 minutes about a very small portion of that landscape, about countries of Central Europe, which after almost 3 decades of very successful political and economic transition are turning their backs on democracy. Now, those countries are Poland and Hungary. This is the first time in the history of the European Union when 2 member states are being investigated for violation of rule of law. And it is the first time in the history of the European Union where 2 countries are breaching the fundamental values of the European Union. Now, the whole thing is becoming more puzzling because as recently as a month ago, Poland was declared the most successful economically country of the entire former Soviet bloc. Poland joined the list of 25 most advanced economies of the world. So we can ask the question, what the hell is going on? Why the most successful country where, you know, GDP per capita quadruple, where the living standards exploded, where all people have opportunity to travel, work, live everywhere in Europe, why that country is turning back on democracy. And could I, because I'm sort of losing the, okay, good. Now, so what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes, really to quickly focus on 3 different things. So first of all, the surprises of post-communist transformations. Then I will briefly talk about what happened after 2004 in terms of backsliding in an authoritarian reversal. And I will talk a little bit about what explains what happened. Right, so that's the story. So where are we 30 years after 89? Where are we 30 years after the collapse of communist regimes? I think that there are several outcomes we can highlight today. So first of all, we have the extraordinary diversity of outcomes. The range of political regimes in the former Soviet space ranges from, you know, quite amazing authoritarian places to almost fully established, fully consolidated democracies. The second thing which needs to be emphasized is that we have a striking geographic distribution of those outcomes. So when you travel from east to west and from north to south, you see that diversity. The east-west story is the old one, but the north-south story is a very interesting new one. All the indicators of economic development or the indicators of quality of democracy are much lower in what was the southern part of the former Soviet bloc and much higher in what was the northern part of the former Soviet bloc. Also, economic reforms, economic success, and political reforms and political success go together. There are very few countries, or none of the countries, which were successful economically and failed politically, and vice versa. Moreover, what we see over the last 30 years are very stable trajectories. We have, when we look at the sub-regions of the former Soviet bloc, we see the countries moving on the sort of parallel trajectories. There are no dramatic changes in the fortune of sub-regions. Those fortunes are sort of stuck in the trajectory beyond they cannot move. And finally, what we see is the stagnation of reforms, the consolidation of authoritarian rule, and the backsliding of those countries which became democratic. Just let me give you just two examples. So here are the data from Freedom House. All of you know that set of research very well, which shows the following thing, right? At the beginning of the transition, we have a group of countries which started to democratize very fast. And in a very short period of time, this group of countries joined the Western Europe and Southern Europe to be considered consolidated democratic regimes. On the other hand, the other groups of countries in the regions were moving on those sort of parallel tracks. So that illustrates a couple of points I already made. Let me give you one more illustration, putting together economic reforms and political reforms. So countries which were really successful politically became successful economically as well. And the countries which did not, reach any did not introduce any political reforms were also not very successful in economic reforms. Okay, so if that's the case, I think we face two fundamental questions. So first of all, what explains the diverging trajectories of post-communist transformations, and why the countries of Central Europe, like Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, were initially so successful? So that's question number one, and we have had, quite amazing debate on this issue over the last 30 years. And then the second critical question is what happened now that those countries those most successful countries are moving back and turning away from democracy. Now, first of all, we need to think about answering those questions, as we were reminded before, in historical terms. Just to, give you one quotation which gets to the really, heart of the matter. Donald Horowitz, a great student of democratic transformations, mostly in Africa, said this, right, that there is no escape from the past. To understand the past means to understand the present state of politics, the present state of economy. So how do we explain the transformation, which were very successful at the very beginning, thinking about those historical factors? So I would say that, first of all, the historical factors and various historical legacies are very important as preconditions for liberal outcomes. We can think about this in terms of Central Europe vis-à-vis other parts of the former Soviet Union. So the most affluent countries in the region under the Soviet rule, and even before the war, became democracies very fast. Those countries which were not rich, which were very peripheral under the old regime, did not succeed in political and economic reforms. Being closer to Europe, being closer to European Union, having friendly relations with the West was a big plus. Those countries really were much more successful initially. Those countries who were successful were countries which introduced liberal economic reforms, but at the same time they were paying much attention to social safety net and welfare policies. In places like Hungary and Poland and Czech Republic, the spending on welfare triple and quadruple over what it was under the communist regime. Now, those countries also had relatively efficient states, well-functioning bureaucracies, and states which were accountable. And the last thing I'm going to use, the Gramscian term, we saw the ascendance of liberal historical bloc. Now, what does it mean? it means, paraphrasing Gramsci, that even those who did not like what was going on in Eastern Europe believe that there is no other way. So even those workers and trade union members in enterprises which were privatized, which were closed down, believed that liberal reforms are the way to go. And I think in the most successful countries, initially in the early 90s, you see those coalitions of people structurally in completely opposite positions who believe in the same thing. I'm emphasizing this because what we see now is the collapse of that liberal historical bloc. And what we see is the emergence of the new historical bloc, which is chauvinist, nationalist, anti-liberal. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the moment. So when those things started to fall apart, we think that, it happened relatively, a few years ago or a couple of years ago in Poland and other places and so on. But as a matter of fact, the sliding back started in 2004. It is paradoxical because this is the year when those countries joined the European Union, became the members of the European Union. And here again is Freedom House showing you how various countries were the scores of democracy in various countries were declining over time. We have very few, very tiny successes in places, where things were so bad that it would be very difficult not to succeed in improving a little bit the scores. But in the main countries, like Poland, like Slovakia, like Hungary, those scores are going down. Here's another look at this. Everyone since 2004 is losing the quality of democracy. And here are those two lines. This is Poland and this is Hungary, where that really decline was very dramatic. We also see that in economic dimension. Here is the graph from European Bank and Reconstruction and Development, showing the stagnation of economic reforms and reversal of economic reforms. And again, paradoxically, the highest number of reversals are coming from the countries which were the most successful members of the European Union. Now, looking at the populists in power, here we are. This is the concentration of populist rule in Europe today. And these are the countries for which we had such high hopes at the beginning of the transition, with all having populist governments of various kinds of coalitions. So what's going on in those countries? I'm going to be very brief just to talk a little bit about Hungary and difference between Hungary and Poland. This is a very famous poster about standing up from the knees because the populists are arguing that Polish governments, previous Polish governments, are kneeling and bowing to Brussels, and now we have to stand up and defend the nationalist cause. And of course, this nationalist cause start to smell quite unpleasant as we go again. So, Hungary first. This is the Prime Minister of Hungary. What is going on in Hungary today? The Hungary is consolidated hybrid regime. Orban secured parliamentary majority, changed the constitution several times, changed electoral law, captured media, captured state institutions. We can predict with 100% who is going to win the next election in Hungary. This is no longer democracy. This is not a tyranny, the way we know tyrannies from the past, but this is not longer democracy. Not liberal, but no longer democracy. Hungary needs EU because it's a small country and needs EU subsidies. So Orban is quite willing to make concessions when pushed very hard, although he's doing that less recently. Hungary is also what a great Hungarian sociologist called the post-communist mafia state. Now, the paradox is that the oligarchs emerged in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union in the kind of bottom-up process neglected by the state, by and large, to a certain point. Now, in Hungary, it happened the other way around. This was Hungarian government who gave the subsidies to their friendly oligarchs, creating this new oligarchy which now supports Hungarian government. And the last thing about Hungary, which needs to be emphasized, is that the liberal opposition is in disarray. Now, what is even more tragic is the only party which can count on some sort of higher support is the fascist Jobbik. And the tragedy of the whole story is that when you look at who votes in various age groups for what kind of political parties, you see that the youngest people in Hungary vote in overwhelmingly for FIDESZ and for Jobbik. This is really a great tragedy unfolding in Hungary, and this is something which we really need to understand. Why the young people who have all the opportunities which were never present in this part of the world are suddenly very unhappy about all of that. Now, of course, the Hungarian regime brought back anti-Semitism in a completely open and transparent way, and of course, it is very anti-EU. So what about Poland? The Polish illiberal democracy is in a different stage and in a different type. The Poland is turning authoritarian in a hurry. They really have to break constitution, they really have to break laws and parliamentary procedures and so on. Orban had enough majority to change the constitutions, but the Polish ruling party don't have that time. Fundamentalist thinking and no concession is the prevailing mood. The opposition is totally demonized. There are traitors, thieves, murderers, scumbags. These are the words uttered from the Polish parliament. And there is this new historical bloc I mentioned. These are chauvinist, the nationalist, the church, extreme right organizations, and so on, emerging in Poland. And they have, on the top of everything, some loony international policy trying to build the opposition to the EU. This is the march of right-wing movements in Poland last year, and this is that combination I just mentioned. So these are the members of the Polish government with the infamous former Minister of Defense. This is the top of the Polish clergy, and above all of that, there is a fascist flag from the pre-war period of the fascist youth organizations. And we can, of course, multiply the ways in which we can describe how low the politics moved in those two countries. There is also something which I describe as salami tactics for the 21st century, where those governments are just slicing political institutions, slice by slice, taking over the state, taking over the media, taking over the economy, and so on. And now, if we apply the Levitsky and Ziblatt test, my two dear friends, they say there are 4 elements which points you to the direction of authoritarian rule. The weak commitment to democratic rules, the legitimization of the opposition, tolerance of violence, and attempts to restrict civil liberties in media. They think in those terms about the US, but this is even more visible in Central Europe. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. Very quickly. So why are we surprised? I think that we missed a couple of very significant developments, or didn't pay enough attention to a couple of very significant developments. We didn't pay much attention to the cost of the round table agreements. They were hailed as, tremendous achievement, innovation in moving from authoritarian rule to democracy, but this was revolution without retribution. Those opposition movements can now point, here are those former communists, here are those former secret police members who succeeded in the new regime while we did not. We also didn't think that the issue of rule of law will be such an important cleavage in post-communist politics. It was clear from the very beginning that there were people who wanted the rule of law, protecting in the process of those functionaries of the old regime, and people who wanted to have nothing to do with the rule of law, but who wanted to punish those who were the former rulers. We also did not pay enough attention to dilemmas of EU accession, and we did not notice the emergence of pillarized civil societies. We pay attention to liberal parts of civil society, but we didn't pay attention to conservative parts of civil society. Today in Poland, there is many more people involved in civil society organizations run by church, run by right-wing press, run by right-wing movements, than there are people involved in civic activities in liberal organizations. This is quite amazing story we miss. So what explains that state of affairs? There are four possible explanations which you see on the slide. So first explanation is the rebellion of transition losers. This is the way in which we explain the rise of populism in Western Europe. Economic problems, marginalizations, and those unhappy with inequalities, those unhappy with economic developments, try to find representation somewhere else. Of course, in Eastern Europe, in these two countries, this really does not apply. This is tremendous economic success. Just, to look at the growth of GDP, Poland did not have a recession in 2008 and so on. So by and large, the economic explanation does not do much, I think, in explaining. Those countries have relatively low levels of poverty. Those countries have relatively low level of inequalities. And on the top of everything, people are happy. When they are asked, what's the situation of your family, whether it's good or bad, you see that the moment Kaczynski PiS party grabbed the power, there were several, times many more happy people in Poland than there were those who were complaining about the transition. So the second explanation which we could think about, and this is more real one, would be to look at the previous 3 decades as a fake modernization. We started to believe that we are living in societies which really want democracy, which really want market economy, that they are very committed to various values of liberal idea. But when we look at the data, we look back and we discover that this was not true. This was our illusion about those countries. So let me just give you one example. Poland. Referendum for the democratic constitution. 42% participated in that referendum, and half, a little over half, voted in favor. That means that slightly over 20% of Polish society supported introduction of democratic constitution. And the 80% either didn't care or were against. And the same applies really a little bit different to EU accession. The third argument is about cultural backlash. You are all familiar with Ron Inglehart and Pippa Norris research. The indicators of this is the economic populism, anxiety about cultural identity, and very peculiar demographic profile of supporters. And of course, there is plenty of data to prove just exactly this, that these are the kind of people who vote for non-liberal parties in Eastern Europe. But the last explanation, I think, is something which I would like to advocate. So first of all, we have two things going on in the same place. We really did not acknowledge how much hardship transition away from communist rule created, how much anxiety, how much anomie. This was, first of all, the process of imposing modernity on those societies, very traditional societies, There were cultural traumas of multiple transitions, first away from communism, then joining the European Union. The world has been changing around those people for the last 30 years. And finally, for the first time, they were confronted with the other. For the first time in 50 years, they went to West European countries, and they thought that they are going to be welcomed with open arms. And those Polish workers suddenly discovered that they are only this higher than Ethiopians and Pakistanis and others. They felt that they are the third-class citizens, and Europe really does not care about them. And it was the same situation with the migration to those countries. So this situation produced the resurgence of traditionalism and cultural polarization and some political hysteria which benefited the populist parties. Now, but the last thing of the story, last piece of the puzzle is something which I call the counter-revolution of the political minority. What we see both in Hungary and Poland, and increasingly in many countries of the former Soviet bloc, is a conscious effort by political minority to take over political power and change liberal political system. That counter-revolution is the counter-revolution really carried out by provincial political and economic elites, which have this distaste for laws and institutions which were built in 1989 transformation. They represent the ethnic nationalist conservative values as strong religious commitments, and they think that when they gain the majority in the parliament, they can do whatever they want. Now, that was going to be the last two sentences. When we were trying to figure out why fascism won in Europe, in several European countries in the intra-war period, we have three predominant explanations. One is a Marxist explanation, that this is about the crisis of capitalism and all the horrible things capitalism does. So Marxists thought that this is the, the mechanism which brings fascists to power. Now, the second explanation was explanation in terms of modernization theory. These are traditional societies which are really being exposed to global competition, liberal values, and so on, and they simply don't like it. That is why they vote for fascist. And then there is a third explanation, which I think really is sort of reminiscent of what is going on in Eastern Europe today. This is an explanation that this is not about working class, this is not about traditional elites, but this is really about middle classes and petty bourgeois. These are people who don't like capitalism. These are people who don't like modernization. These are people whose life were disrupted in one way or another. And these are people who want to really keep things the third way, against liberalism and against capitalism. So I think that's the is the social glue which keeps this counter-revolution going on in Central Europe today alive. Thank you very much.